Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. You are once again welcome to this webinar by Castle Think Tank. And today we will be speaking to the subject of housing and settlements. It's a very good pleasure for us to have you again. My name is Paul Michael, and today I will be moderating this discussion here today. But before we proceed into the webinar, allow me to invite Mrs. Angelina Chinomjini, who is a member of the coordinating team of the Castle Think Tank, to come and open up our discussion with a word of prayer. Angelina.
Thank you, Paul. Good morning, everyone. Let us pray. Almighty God, we thank you for the opportunity that you've given us this morning to be able to deliberate on the housing and settlement sector. We thank you that your mercies are new every morning and great is your faithfulness. We ask that you would lead and direct us and give us wisdom, solutions, and recommendations that would be able to push this housing sector to the next level for the transformation of this nation. In Jesus' name we've prayed and believed. Amen.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Chinomjini. Now we proceed into the webinar. A couple of comments and reminders before we get into the main discussions. We will be posting poll questions. We have 4 poll questions ready. And once about every 30 minutes, we will be putting up a poll question for every person that is on this webinar to respond to. When you see that pop up on the screen, we shall introduce it and let you know that it's coming up. And definitely the poll question is speaking to the subject at hand today. So when you see that poll question coming up, kindly participate and give your view on every question as might be posted to you. So when you see the poll question coming up, please participate so that we can hear your views on each and every one of these questions. And we will also have a provision. If you look at your screen, there is a provision for Q&A. So if you want to chat into the webinar for the panelists to see your question or your comment, kindly utilize the Q&A chat room. Do not use the chat. There's 2 options there. There's a Q&A and chat. Kindly take note that the comments that you need to make should sit in the Q&A chat room, and your panelists will be able to respond to those particular questions or comments. And then for this webinar today, the hashtags are #CastleWebinar and #ThriveHousing. #CastleWebinar and #ThriveHousing.
Okay.
So in terms of the discussion today, shelter and housing is one of the basic needs of humanity since time immemorial. In fact, one can say that shelter, food, and clothing constitute 80% of the motivations for human beings to be involved in any economic activity at all. Recently, during the COVID-19 pandemic, a number of things happened around this space that reveal the critical nature of housing and settlements to us all. Landlords, for instance, have had to renegotiate terms with tenants in many cases. And in some cases, they have had to waive rental arrears as well. Tenants have also realized the critical relationship they have with their landlords. When now one takes a close look at the housing and settlement space in Uganda, sand and earthen or clay brick are leading materials in the sector for use in creating these living spaces. A close look at the more recent events, however, reveals that both are swiftly getting into short supply and therefore are not sustainable. This factor alone is accruing into price escalation for housing and settlements constructions. Globally, many countries have resorted to developing wood, gypsum board, steel, and many other materials into prefabs, as well as interlocking technologies that are easier on both material and labor compared to the above 2 commonly used materials in Uganda's case. As the Ugandan economy continues to grow, it is also increasingly clear the importance of planned settlements to provide for healthy living, ease of commuting, ease of access to utilities, organized livelihood. And in a number of cases, there's constant reminders around us of the importance of planned settlements and the runaway cost of disconcerted human settlements and developments. Post COVID-19, the President of Uganda, His Excellency Yoweri Kaguta Museveni, has as well made shelter one of his critical agendas for a Uganda developed. Today in this webinar, we look at housing and settlements in Uganda and how we can move this into more affordable, accessible, and practical approaches as we move towards a Uganda developed. The webinar discussion is therefore focusing on this and how we can move forward into the desired state. Once again, I welcome you to this webinar, and I would like to invite Dr. James Magara, the chairman of Castle Think Tank, to make his opening remarks, and then we shall move into the discussion. Dr. Magara.
Thank you very much, Paul, and very good morning to all of you. I would like to very specially welcome our special guest who will be joining us, Honorable Dr. Chris Wariomosi, the Minister of State for Housing, the sector we're involved in. Also, very, very special welcome to our panelists. Thank you very much for accepting to be part of this conversation. We always say we are borrowing your brains for a few hours, so we hope we'll get the best of your thinking, because Castle is a think tank. Castle was initiated, or rather inaugurated last year, and our goal is really to increase the marketplace, the goods on the marketplace of ideas. Ideas are very important. In fact, some people say ideas rule the world. And if we don't have a good source of ideas, we cannot make the right decisions. So our goal is really that, to increase the products on the marketplace of ideas so that decision makers, policy makers, private sector, public sector can shop from these ideas. And by shop, I don't mean paying money necessarily, but you have somewhere to choose from as you make decisions. And it's been shown over the last 60 or so years of the countries that have had good thought leadership are the ones that have been able to make it. It's not so much the natural resources, it's how you think and apply your mind to the situations that are around you. So this is our goal. And this is, if I remember correctly, it's like the 9th in a series. We are looking at, I've been looking at very many different sectors. When the pandemic started, we decided to focus our eyes on the opportunities. One common statement we've used here is that every dark cloud has a silver lining. So we decided not to look at the dark cloud, which is called the COVID pandemic, but look at the silver lining. And so for each of these different topics or sectors we're covering, our focus is on what are the opportunities. So today we are having a conversation, as you've already been told, on housing and settlements. And we've already had a workshop a couple of months ago, about 3 months ago, where we had brainstorming as a think tank. Then we got papers that were written out of those brainstorms were reviewed. Today we are presenting our ideas, some of ideas, not all of them, but some of them. And we are having a panel of experts critique the ideas and also giving an opportunity to the public to make their input. This is all being tracked. So the ideas that are picked out of this seminar will not end here. They'll end up in an extension of the document we already have. And that document is ending up on the desks of policymakers, decision makers. It will also end up on our website. So as we think about these sectors, we have a point of reference. So as I say, please let's open up our minds. Let us bring ideas. We are thinking outside, even outside the box. We need to question some of the things we're doing. So I hope we'll have a very, very engaging conversation. Thank you once again, panelists. Thank you, participants, for sparing this precious Saturday morning. And we trust and hope that what comes out of here will propel the housing sector forward, but will also propel our country forward. Thank you very much, and over to you, Paul.
Thank you, Dr. Magara. And in no order of preference or importance, on the webinar this morning, we are privileged to host as panelists the following people. Discussant number 1 will be Architect Patricia Kayongo Rutiba. Discussant number 2, Dr. Charles Amoti Kojo. Discussant number 3, Mr. Sam Wabasa. And discussant number 4, Mr. Michael K. Mugabe. And we shall be introducing their profiles just before each discussant comes forward. It's also important to note that we will be privileged to host the Minister of State for Lands, Housing and Urban Development in the Cabinet of the Republic of Uganda, the Honorable Dr. Munsi, who is also the elected Member of Parliament representing Kinkizi County East as our special guest today. And moderating this discussion is yours truly, Kenya Paul Michael, a member of the Board of Directors for the Castle Think Tank. However, as we move into this discussion, I would like us today to be kicked us off by Architect Patrick Rubongoya. And I'm going to be introducing Mr. Rubongoya's profile in order for us to understand who he is. Mr. Rubongoya is the founding director of Pan Modern Consult Limited, one of the leading architecture firms where he serves as the principal architect and project manager. Patrick has over 20 years in the field of architecture and building construction. He is impassioned by efficient land use, planning, and management, particularly urban planning and affordable housing. To this end, together with colleagues, he has invested in modern cost-cutting solutions aimed at drastically bringing down the cost of construction generally and in the housing sector. And these are some of his concerns he has been involved with. House of Concrete East Africa Limited, one of the few ready-mix companies that can supply fresh concrete anywhere, anytime, at very unbeatable rates. Habitera Technology Limited, a masonry building technology company that cuts cost to between 30 to 40% of any current known methods, as well as lowers the speed of construction by more than half, while ensuring quality and compliance. Pendeza Flooring and Coating Specialists, who offer flooring, wall coating solutions at highly competitive rates. Ultimately, the combination of these solutions will greatly contribute to addressing the housing question in the country and region at large. Patrick holds a bachelor's degree in architecture from Makerere University, Uganda. He's also a corporate member of the Uganda Society of Architects and a registered architect with the Architects Registration Board of Uganda. Welcome with me, Patrick, to present his paper. Patrick. Patrick, kindly unmute your microphone. Go ahead, we can hear you now.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul, and fellow panelists and CASO at large, led by Dr. Magara. It's my pleasure and humble duty this morning to speak to this very noble and challenging field. Indeed, as you introduced, the shelter and housing in particular, the need cannot be emphasized enough. It is only a third after food and clothing in terms of needs, basic needs for humanity at large. And the COVID pandemic has really highlighted that the housing or our homes are our true haven. And it has thus pointed out the urgent need of addressing this acute shortage that we face, and also highlighted the poorly planned settlements and neighborhoods in our country. Well, all sectors, closed, the housing was one that could not close down. And especially in the urbanizing and developing Africa, the impending economic slowdown and the likely ensuing unemployment will mean that this situation could get even worse, especially, like you pointed out, the likelihood of delay in rentals and mortgage payments and the evictions, and also delay in payments of utilities are a high risk generally, but particularly to the urban population who are largely low and middle income. And I emphasize middle income because in our country, like ours, middle income and low income are almost equal. And so that is a serious problem. And due to the deprived accessibility, if you see in many of our settlements, they could not be accessible. And they could not even be traced. It's very difficult to address any home. And even with the digital migration as a substitute for delivery and supply of commodities, because of poor connectivity, it was a problem. The children and adults could not find, suitable outdoor spaces because of the poor planning that has been alluded to. And some of them, you remember, resorted to roadside and as an alternative for recreation. And again, and more intriguing, our homes became our workstations as people were told to work from home. And they also became, for those who could afford, because many have not made it yet, they became classrooms for our population, for our young children. And that speaks on the need for us to really think critically about housing. Footing and riding became the alternative means of transport. But because of this urban sprawl that the country, and particularly Kampala, has experienced, the distances were unbearable. As opposed to, what we're used to commuting by, public means. And this is also because of a centralized approach in terms of our planning. The CBD is very far from our, residential wards. And so what COVID pandemic and what we are saying at CASO is that it has only accentuated this problem of, housing and the modest planning that we're experiencing, especially in our capital city. And so that background has really shown that any slight shock, the field will be exposed. And this is not only been for Uganda. This pandemic has really exposed the housing question globally. The lack of adequate and affordable housing. And to that I will come back later, because we need to understand when we talk affordability in housing, what exactly do we mean? So the problem is not only here, the problem is global, and the pandemic has exposed that problem of shelter, especially as I pointed out, the urban low and middle income earners. In the more advanced countries, the homelessness and pitiable security of tenure have been accentuated as well. And we might have been spared, as you mentioned, that our landlords have been lenient. But this problem is being global, and it cannot be emphasized enough. But particularly focusing on our country here, the developing and rapidly urbanizing, the situation, as mentioned, would get harder if we do not up our game with poorly planned and ill-serviced settlements and largely inaccessible neighborhoods. This has also been emphasized by the fact that the government, the presence of the government in this sector, the direct participation is largely missing. And this has led to a mushrooming of informal settlements and slum developments in urban centers and all over the country. Kampala alone is said to have more than 60 informal settlements. This, of course, is also coupled with the challenge of urban sprawl, meaning that families and communities cannot easily cope with such challenges. Habitat has put the housing deficit for the country at 2.4, and according to Habitat records, 210,000 units are needed globally, although that number is contested. Center for Affordable Housing for Africa puts that figure at 420,000 units for Kampala alone. But these figures, whatever they are, they speak to the magnitude of the problem that we are faced with, that we need to address ourselves to. And even in rural setup, more than 1 million units are needed. And it is important to note that, and that is according to the National Housing Survey, that this problem is growing against a growing population, and that we will require 3 million more units, of which 25 to 30% are semi-permanent. You pointed out the issue of poor construction materials. Within one downpour, quite a number of units are written off. So it means that even the housing stock we have is very vulnerable because of our poor methods of construction. And of course, articulated with poverty, people cannot afford to construct desirable houses. So the housing deficit is only slated to increase. And just to tease our minds, what contributes to this demand? This demand is particularly a factor mainly of the demographic characteristics. Our country is very young, and that means the age bracket that is in the zone of demanding for houses is very high, and we need to contend with that. That is an issue. But also, we are faced with a lot of rapid urbanization, unchecked. That is another issue that increases demand, especially in our urban centers, and particularly Kampala. Migration. This is something that is in the background. Daily Monitor did indicate the other day, a few weeks back, that we have 10,000 Chinese in this country. And that is not talking about other, races who are coming into our country. And those also put pressure on our housing. We are housing many, many refugees all around. We are the center. We are the main host in the region. That also exerts pressure. And of course, I had already alluded to the fact that even the already existing stock, dilapidates at a very fast rate. So annually, the rate of demand of new stock is increasing against those pointed out, factors. It is important to note that in the sector also, the people who are playing in this area of provision of housing are mainly the private sector, and they are profit-oriented. And so they really don't service what we are talking about in terms of affordability in housing. Even if we put it so low, to 50 to 70 million a unit, that is very inaccessible by many of our depraved, the depraved population. But also important to note is the fact that even these players have very few. Their contribution is just a dot in the ocean. We have, I think, about 15 players, and each one is only capable of, contributing 100 units per annum. And between them, they were only able to deliver, 700 units, mainly condominiums, and even then in Kampala. And without emphasizing the point, out of reach for the low and middle income, largely. And the situation against that background can get worse. Not forgetting that we are a unique country with a myriad system of land tenure. We are a unique country with a myriad system of land tenure. This has resulted in two fragmentation. So even these players, even if they were able, they are confronted with a problem of, chunks of land that they can develop. Where big chunks exist, especially in central Uganda, these are infested by squatters, and they are not very attractive to investors because it is time wasting. It is at times very highly political, and so it's not attractive. And so we cannot even take advantage of it. They cannot even take advantage of economies of scale. Globally, we committed to the, Sustainable Development Goals, in particular, goal number 11, which, aspires to making cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. And we need to understand what we committed to when we say inclusiveness. And I think the pandemic has exposed this need for inclusiveness. At times we feel that the problem is far removed. But I will tell you, who are these people we are talking about in the low and middle income category? These are not the riffraff low. They are your fresh graduates yet to be employed and struggling to get employment. They are your nurses. They are your doctors. They are your drivers, if you like. They are your cleaners. I think the ministry during the pandemic had to work day and night. And during day and night, they realized some of their essential staff were the cleaners and the drivers. And it was very risky for them to go home, to commute from home with this zero distancing and, control of contact. If you like, many countries have been affected by this poor, housing in that sector in that category of low and middle income. Singapore, for instance, one thing that was their Achilles heel was the issue that the migrants' housing was lacking. And so their efforts to contain the pandemic just went out of control. And it's been noted over and again that the future of our planet depends on getting our cities right, and largely having the housing sector in our cities correct. And that was highlighted by none other than the Chief Executive Director, UN Habitat, Mr. Sharif, while addressing the premier World Urban Forum. And he did also point out to a few statistics that should really have our minds thinking. It is important to note that on a daily basis, 3 million people are added on these urban centers and towns. It is also important to note that currently, our urban centers are housing 50% of the population. Without going back in the previous statistics, you will see that there has been a sudden rise in urbanization, especially in Africa. And it is also projected that by year 2050, 75% of the global population will have been urbanized. To put that into perspective, that means we will require 3 planets if everything remains constant according to the current setup. That is huge. That's a huge demand for housing and for all other things that go with it: the food, the water, the utilities. And so it is very imperative that we prepare for this now than later. The government has crafted a very good document, the Vision 2024. And it's not only the vision, but they've gone ahead to work towards operationalizing it. They have come up with 33 vision targets. They have come up with 13 flagship projects, including the development of 5 regional cities and 5 strategic cities. These are very welcome gestures in terms of foresight and planning and preparedness. And in the same vein, they have articulated some important policies. We'll address ourselves to those that really are, pertinent with the question at hand. The reformation of education system is very important. It speaks to, readying the construction industry, investment directly into strategic industries. That is very important because we would like to see that some of the imported materials are manufactured here. So with this gesture from government, this is a very welcome, position. Establishment of an infrastructure fund. This at CASO is a very welcome idea because it, arguments very well with our, thinking. In addition, the government has pointed out that the funding of this vision is going to be by government, CSOs, development partners, and the private sector, for which we really seek to speak for. And this is very welcome, and we'll come to this later in some of our humble proposals and recommendations that we are making if we are going to realize the vision's, aspiration, which is seeing a transformed Ugandan society from a peasant to a modern and prosperous country within 30 years. And as I mentioned, within 30 years, about 75% of our population will have urbanized. So notwithstanding, at CASO we have quarrels with this vision. We feel that the vision does not specifically address itself about Kampala as our gateway, and we will divulge later into this, and also does not specifically address itself in addressing this challenge of housing, and especially in Kampala. Our thinking at CASO is that giving this prominence is very critical, and it is not just CASO. This is an internationally known approach. China has used it, India has used it. Every country has got its main growth center, which then impacts and spreads to the rest of the country. While the proposal for the 5 regional and strategic cities is welcome, as it is one of the ways of actually decongesting Kampala because it stems the rapid and unchecked urbanization that we are experiencing. However, that should not take away the importance of Kampala and its housing challenge. I mentioned earlier that over 60% of the Kampala population is slum dwellers. And I also mentioned that we have more than 60 of them informal settlements. And it should be, a question to everybody. How can a plot of land in Kampala, in Kololo, cost millions of dollars, and yet a stone throw away, it goes for peanuts? That is in the CBD, in the heart of our city. How come most of the private developers are concentrated only on Kampala Road and they will not touch, the immediate surrounding areas? That shows that our city is in serious decay. And at CASO, we want to propose that there should be a Marshall Plan for rejuvenation of our city for obvious reasons. It is our beacon. It is our gateway. Every innovation, every foreign direct investment that comes into our country can only do so if our city is performing well. So we would like to implore the government through the Honorable Minister that this is given due attention. On the other hand, the housing sector, as mentioned, lies under the Ministry of Lands, Housing and Urban Development, but the government's role has only been limited to to offering a conducive policy, legislative and regulatory framework, which is very good because this will create efficiency and effectiveness in the delivery of houses, hopefully. However, the policy is making some commitments, the housing policy.
We have another 5 minutes to present.
Okay. And so these challenges are quite enormous. I had pointed out the challenges is privately driven, huge backlog, lack of housing generally, but mainly low cost, high cost of construction, poor construction materials, lack of access to affordable construction and mortgage financing, absence of co-financing, no donor-funded project in this sector. And so we would like to implore government to address itself on that. And we have a few recommendations to make. And these recommendations, as we said, they are opportunities. There's a massive deficit, and so we should look at it as an opportunity. The banking sector would, thrive. The manufacturing and construction manufacturing of construction materials is an open way. This will, create employment. Investment in housing always has multiple trade-offs and spin and offshoots, which are very, very key for the development of our country. The readiness and the willingness of the government to intervene through PPP is very important, but we need to, actualize this. And so we are proposing creation of a fund. And this fund would be even perform much better because it can be, it can be recycled and give opportunity for even a modest, contribution, but yet give affordable housing. And so we need to rethink our urban approach. Everywhere, there's a thinking of smart city, smart cities, smart nations in some cases. Our country was declared an entirely planning area. And so that means we need to be thinking of it globally as a smart nation like other countries have done. We need to develop a multi-sectoral platform to allow us engage in research, planning, and collaboration. And this would also work as an intermediary between the private sector and government. Creation of, construction, housing, and infrastructure development bank. But along that, we are proposing that some national agencies are reoriented and revitalized. The National Housing Corporation, the Housing Finance, and the Department of Mapping and Surveying. These are very key to the sector, especially the Department of Mapping and Surveying, without going into so much. Spatial data for planning is very, very important. And I would like to interrogate this further by, challenging the government. And at CASO, we want to challenge, the powers that be to claim our rightful position on very important regional bodies to which we belong. The Resource Center for Mapping.
Sorry, Mr. Rubongoya, you have a minute to go to complete.
Okay, the resource, thank you, Paul. The Resource Center for Mapping in Kenya, we are, category A ownership. Shelter Afrique, we've looked at their, financials. Our benefits are very dismal, and this is very disheartening because these are key in addressing what we are, talking about this morning. And lastly, two proposals is the deliberate capacity building of the construction industry, along with the built environment professional bodies. The government has not addressed itself in preparing this sector very well, and that's why it is mainly dominated by outside players. And then, of course, we need to have a system that incentivizes new and innovative, methods of delivering housing and new ways of delivering housing. We need to get away from one man, one plot syndrome. There are other ways of delivering houses. And if the government can structure incentives, maybe tax rebates and, so that we can have opportunities and options to deliver this and solve the problem. The benefits cannot be emphasized enough. The sustainability of land use cannot be emphasized enough. Improved affordability of settlement and guaranteeing of security of tenure, which is a challenge with this pandemic. Job creation, improved economy generally. There are many spin-offs that we can realize if we handle this sector very well. And then, of course, collaboration among stakeholders and agencies. So, Paul, I would like to conclude here because of lack of time, but the opportunities and the challenges at CASO are immense that we can partner with government and, make a humble contribution to our nation. Thank you very much. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, all listeners. Back to you, Paul.
Thank you, Mr. Bongoya, for that presentation. And we also want to appreciate the Housing Finance Bank that have made a contribution in terms of supporting CASO Think Tank. We do appreciate your standing with us and with the thinking process in Uganda. Thank you very much, Housing Finance Bank, for sponsoring this discussion here today. We are going to be having a poll question shortly popping up on your screen. Like we agreed earlier on, when that question pops up, kindly make your view known or your contribution to that question. So I request the team that is supporting this webinar to present the question so that we can poll. The question is, what is Uganda's most pressing housing problem? What is Uganda's most pressing housing problem? Is it home ownership? Home ownership is only for a few due to high costs of mortgage finance, or shortage of housing units for low-income families, or poor or no central planning for human settlements. Kindly make your view known as we wait on you. I note that a number of us have not yet participated, but we need to hear from you. What is Uganda's most pressing housing problem? Is it that home ownership is only for a few due to high costs of mortgage finance? Is it shortage of housing units for low-income families? Is it poor or no central planning of human settlements? Please let us hear your view on that poll as we go on. But as we wait for the poll to end, we'll be posting a poll question every 30 minutes. So please get ready to make your view known. Broadcast us on your Twitter and your Facebook, because we are running on both channels. And hashtags is CASO Webinar and Thrive I see Thrive Housing. CASO webinar and Thrive Housing. Again, for the panelists, please go to the Q&A section and respond to the questions and views and comments made there. The poll is ending shortly in the next couple of seconds. And I think we are done with the poll now. Thank you so much. Most of us think that poor or no central planning of human settlements is Uganda's most pressing problem, because 55% of us have highlighted that as the biggest issue. And then shortage of low housing comes in as 26%. And then home ownership only for a few due to high mortgage costs is only at 18%. Thank you very much for participating in that poll. We do appreciate. Now we are moving on to the next discussant, architect Patricia Kayongo Rutiba. Patricia is the managing director of Dream Architects Limited. She has over 20 years of experience in design and construction, supervision of projects in both government and non-government or private sector. She has served as honorary secretary of Uganda Secretary of Architects, Society of Architects, between 2008 to 2009, and then as a council member between 2006 and 2011. She was appointed by the Minister of Lands, Housing and Urban Development to sit on the Architects Registration Board between 2012 and 2013. Patricia holds a Bachelor of Architecture from Makerere University and is a registered architect in Uganda. Welcome, Patricia. Kindly give us your views on this paper.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Welcome, listeners. Good morning, everyone. I want to appreciate CASO for organizing this think tank discussion. And I also want to appreciate Patrick for that think piece presentation that is going to help us to, hash out some solutions for this big challenge we have. This discussion is very critical. It's very important. And as feedback to what Patrick was talking about, and even the poll reaction about the planning, the problem is systematic in the sense that it starts from the planning level. Even if individuals had resources to put up their own units, without planning, the overall planning, it would be disastrous. So there were some comments I had, because he focused on the area of the city of Kampala. I want to mention some things that the city should take into consideration, because it is going to be the model city for the other cities that have been formed in this country. So the city requirements for infrastructure development management, we feel, when we've had these discussions with fellow architects, we feel the city needs to have a structure that caters not only for political members or political leadership, but also caters for the technical. The city structure does not have enough slots for engineers and for architects. Surprisingly, if you were to do the staffing check or inspection of Kampala Capital City Authority, you'd find that you have very few architects, very few engineers, very many lawyers, many other staff and administration. But then when it comes to checking the plans, you find that people who are inspecting architectural plans, not all of them are architects, or not many are architects. The people who are checking the engineering structural drawings are very few. So that is a big challenge, because it means even at a planning level now, if your planners are busy checking, for example, plans for approval, they are not available to do the actual planning, detailed neighborhood planning, what would make this city actually work. So that you have residences alone, and then you have other developments on their own. So the other issue is unqualified personnel are being appointed to do work that people who are actually qualified can do. That is endemic actually in many of the government structures. So we just need to be able to organize ourselves enough to have qualified people doing this. And then the other issue is the budget. If you look at the budget of most of the urban areas, very little is given to the planning department, the physical planning department. It actually has the smallest, the most recent budget. I don't have the statistics for that, but the one before, the smallest component of the budget was actually physical planning department. So that needs to be taken care of so that the city can be better planned. The other thing that I'm going to look at a bit in detail is the building materials. We have very expensive building materials that are approved for use in construction, but there are sustainable solutions that are coming up all over the world, especially in third world countries, materials that can be used that are lower cost and that are actually available with us here. But they are not in our building regulations, and we don't even have standards for them, and not much research has been done for them. If this is done, it means that people are going to have more options for constructions which are cheaper and that can get more units done. For the cost of one house made of brick, cement, blocks, you can actually have several houses done if you have a lower cost solution for the same cost. So when I looked at this option, this issue of materials now, I'm going into that the think tanks should also take into consideration is that funding should be provided, especially to institutions and even UNBS, to do research on several options that are actually cheaper, like earth construction. Even our own vernacular ideas and people in rural areas, you're not budgeting for the construction of a house out of concrete and brick and mortar. You're actually budgeting based on the vernacular architecture that is in those rural areas to deal with the crisis of housing. Because according to the statistic Patrick talked about, it's about 1.3 vis-a-vis 400 and something thousand. If we were to look at it critically, if we're looking at using low-cost materials, the need upcountry can actually be resolved faster because the materials are there. They are just not researched. They are not researched and not approved for construction. The use of stone, for example, this country has rock quarries all over the country, but we don't use them for construction. We use them, okay, maybe a bit aggregate mixing concrete, but we don't use actual cut stone for construction in Uganda. And yet we have stone that can be used. It just hasn't been tested, tried, and researched. We also have, we normally use stone just to face clad the buildings, and that's not good enough. Even bamboo, Uganda has a very good climate for growing bamboo. It's an option, but it's not used. Recycled materials are also an option, glass and plastic, but they are not used. There are other solutions, modular homes from prefabricated, the Rugolovi flats that we saw. One flat would be built in a week because they were using factory prefabricated panels. And that was very low cost, very effective in terms of numbers and time. And that was done many, many years ago. But now today we are struggling with putting up one block of flats, which is unsustainable. So when I looked at these issues that were being raised, you find that if we don't find local homegrown solutions, we end up having to depend on imports like we're doing right now. When cement is being made, we have that limestone available locally, but clinker comes from abroad. And that's a challenge because when the borders are closed, it means we can't have cement, then the prices shoot up and people can't build. But if we had our own homegrown solutions and we relied on the limestone and the stone and other materials that are available, then we'd be able to continue providing our own homes without a big challenge. There's also the case study. I was looking at Singapore. I think Patrick mentioned Singapore when he was talking. He mentioned their biggest weakness was dealing with housing for the foreigners or the immigrants who came in. But for Uganda, the biggest challenge is actually the locals. They're the ones who don't have housing. You can work for many years and even earn, but you may end up building when you're 60, retiring, maybe when you get your NSSF money, and that is not right. So if we are to have civil rest as opposed to civil unrest. The basic needs of our countrymen need to be met. So when I looked at the case study of Singapore, they had 9% housing provided by government in 1959. By 2017, they had 80% housing for their citizens. And that was a span of about 60 years. So when you think about it, government should enable housing markets, yes, but also government should be involved in housing markets because the provisions for it are actually either owned by the people through land for Uganda's case. So they also have equity to put into the equation when they're getting their housing, or they have their savings that they have put in a providence fund like NSSF or any other retirement fund. So these are things that can be tools that can be used to provide funding for some of this housing. As a nation, in the housing solution, we should avoid segregation kind of housing. We need to be looking at inclusive housing that is multi-use, but also multi-income mix. Because when you don't do the multi-income kind of provision, you end up with ghetto projects where all the people who are given low-cost housing are put separately from the rest. And then those are the areas that get dilapidated, like the situation in New York. And then even in Paris, they are called banlieues. They are the ghetto areas where people don't dare to go. Whereas Singapore solved this problem by doing mixed income housing, where all incomes were represented. They also did smart use of urban density by creating green cities, which are healthier to live in. And wrapping it up, they did integrated approach to land use because they have very little land. We are better off because we have more land, so we should be able to pull this off. They also had long-term political commitment, and that is what we need. And that's the appeal that CASO has given to government, long-term political commitment to providing housing. When people have security in terms of housing, they don't vandalize because they could vandalize their own property. So we have to partner in those PPPs that he talked about. Then fair and open, transparent procedures for distribution of housing. Even ethnic quotas were used in Singapore to make sure each ethnic group was represented as they distribute housing. So if the government is willing to do this and work, then we'll not have these housing issues anymore. Thank you very much. That was my response to the presentation.
Thank you, Patricia, on the note of inclusive housing, and we'll be back to that one. It sounds interesting to hear a little bit more on how you can get housing to be more inclusive. But we'll be taking on discussant number 2, and that is Dr. Charles Amoti Kojo. Dr. Charles Amoti Kojo is a senior environmentalist and manager at Urban Research and Training Consultancy Company, East Africa Limited, where he is the team lead for physical and environmental planning projects and assignment. Dr. Kojo has over 20 years of experience as an environmental expert and senior physical planner. His multidisciplinary experience embraces development policy analysis, planning and programming, institutional building, enterprise development, and the links among such issues as poverty, gender equity, climate change, and environmental sustainability. Dr. Charles holds a Bachelor of Sciences, Physical Geography, and a Master of Sciences, Physical Geography and Natural Resources from Lviv University, State University, Ukraine, and Master's Physical Planning, MPP, as well as a PhD Physical Planning from Makerere University. I cannot think a great point other than this point at which Dr. Sam comes in. Welcome, Dr. Sam. Let us hear your views about the paper. Over to you, sir.
Oh, thank you very much, the moderator and everybody. I think I will start from the national perspective. Many of the issues raised by Patrick and my fellow good friend, architect Patricia, I'll look at it from the three realms of settlements at a national level. That is the rural, urban, and intermediate kind of subsystems. The subsystems we're talking about are generally, which is the focus of most of these discussion settlements, has been on urban settlements. Now, I want to bring in the element of urbanization versus urbanity, rural settlements versus rurality. Now, we have had an opportunity as a country to have the Vision 2040. And currently, the Ministry of Lands and Urban Development undertook a national physical development plan, which I was part of. And to make it very interesting, there are now few countries in Africa. South Africa, for the last 80 years, 80, 90 years, it's not by mistake that possibly their settlement partners, their spatial organization of a country are fairly good compared to many of the African developing countries, because they have had a national spatial development frameworks. So as a country, Ghana, I think, is another country coming up. Sub-Saharan Africa, last 5 years. Kenya has just finished their 2015, the National Spatial Development Plan. Uganda, I'm told, it's at draft level, but the opportunities therein gives us a chance to reorganize, to reconstruct the settlements and other special land uses in the country. I'll look at urban settlements as a special land use in their own right. GKMA, the Greater Kampala Metropolitan Area, in its own right is an urban settlement as a special land use. Now, we have the urbanization policy in place, where we are saying that on 1 square kilometer, we can have a population of 15,000 people, 1,500 people, households settled in 1 square kilometer. Currently, the level of densities vis-a-vis population is very low. In other words, we should be talking about readjustment, consolidation, infilling, urban renewals, and ensure that our policy of urbanization is in tandem with our future projected population. The National Physical Plan looks at about 80 million people in the next 23 years. The question is, where would all these people be settled? The settlement partner we have is just urbanization and sprawling. This is caused by lack of proper rural planning. Rural planning has a bearing to our urban settlements. There should be areas for where some other services like food, agriculture should be able to be done. Not everywhere should have development of settlements. So that's critical in terms of how it will affect how our cities, our towns develop. Now, to go into the issue of urbanity. Urbanity is the quality of life. It's not just enough to give a house, a settlement, and activities of people without looking what is the quality. This is the most critical part, and it bears a bearing on human, social, economic, and space physically where you organize it. So I think the think tank, CASO, should be able to focus and see how many of our country's population vis-a-vis the available space. This country is not going to be extended possibly by another inch. It will be 241 square kilometers. You have to live somewhere. So we are saying in the national development plan, whereby the levels of planning now, which should be at a region of, for instance, Jinja, Kampala, Mpigi, the Lake Victoria corridor is becoming very highly urbanized. But the question is, can all other activities, land uses, be well defined, be well organized, than being opposed to the way we are doing it, business as usual? So the issue currently is to ensure that the rural, what we're calling the rural urban kind of settlement, is supposed to change in terms of the numbers. And this can be done by, for instance, if we bring in the issues to do with services. But one major factor, our people livelihoods are going to be so much tied to the agriculture sector. We have, for instance, looked at the issue to do with the cattle corridor. The cattle corridor extends from Isinjiro up to Karamoja. Very few animals, 14 million animals in that corridor, but the number, the area of the cattle corridor vis-a-vis the urban settlements should be well thought of, and we are thinking very critically that if they are well organized, country land is not very expensive, some of those areas can act as centers for consolidation and coming up with some new settlements so that people can have where they live, where they work, and ensure that our population in the next possibly 100 years, we still have areas where we can have our settlements well defined and the quality improved. Mr. Rubongoya talked about so much about Kampala. Kampala is very critical. I think there's a need. The population count of Kampala is about, the GKMA, maybe 3-4 million. The optimum number we need to have in the GKMA should be about 8 million, maybe by 2040. If we to attain that scenario of 8 million, we need to have 2 new cities within the GKMA. Some of these areas have been identified. The area between Kampala and Entebbe, where we have the Kajansi-Sisa area, and the Mpata in Tenjeru. I feel, we believe there's opportunity now to have those new satellite towns developed to accommodate possibly each of those 1 million people. That means you'll be having a very good lake frontage developed, more activities, connectivity around, and then are opposed to the sprawling of the GKMA. So there are a lot of opportunities, and I think COVID, as everybody is looking at it, currently, I don't believe that the current prices of land are so exorbitant that if government thought very, very hard and critically, this is the time to acquire big chunks of land at the current prices, buy them, so that any other developer or people putting in money in national housing and other sectors could be able to redevelop those areas and have some new cities. So I think we have opportunities. We have thought very hard, and I commend the policymakers to start looking ahead. I'm not so much worried about the current levels of settlements. If the settlements can be put in right interfaces with other land uses, there's opportunities to make money and make our settlements much better. So the situation of organization are very, very high. The other systems which are opportunity in the GKMA or Jinja Kampala Mpigi corridor is the ecosystems approach. Our settlements are being compromised. They are affecting some of these well livelihoods happen, like wetlands. we are not seeing the wetlands as being one of the major uses which can have better values for our settlements. So I think there's a lot of need for integration and ensure that at that strategic level, all other local lower plans can be able to fit in that kind of bigger picture. In short, in a nutshell, I think it is something we are moving towards. We should be able to attain if we become very serious in thinking. And Paul Bukenya, you talked to us about thinking critically and thinking ahead other than thinking only as we are now. There's always, lastly, what I call the principle of succession and invasion. The invasion, the conversion will take place, but should be done in orderly and organized manner. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Charles. Indeed, you've ended at a point of ecosystems approach, which I think is again another subject we may need to touch on a little bit as we move ahead. Thank you so much, all our attendees so far. We're going to be having our second poll question shortly, but I just need to encourage the panelists. There's a lot of questions and comments in the Q&A section that have not been attended to. Some of them are very specific to some of us on the call today, and others are generic, so any one of us panelists could pick up on these and respond to them. So kindly look at the Q&A section and let's begin to respond to those issues there. I would like to ask the team that is running the polls to put up the second poll, and the poll reads: what should be prioritized to meet Uganda's housing deficit, especially for low-income earners? What should be prioritized to meet Uganda's housing deficit, especially for low-income earners? The first option is government through National Housing and Construction Corporation should focus on low-cost houses and let private developers cater for high income. Number two, government should establish a special housing fund capped at 10% per interest rate per annum. And then land should be, I think land priority should be, I'm sorry, I don't see the end of that question, but I hope it is clearly visible to the rest of us who are polling. What should be prioritized to meet Uganda's housing deficit, especially for low-income earners? Kindly let your poll response be known. Kindly let your poll response be known because we need to hear from you on the priorities that Uganda should make in addressing the housing deficit, especially for low-income earners. We should be done with this poll in the next couple of 10 seconds. Please let us know your views on that poll. Thank you so much. 47% of you subscribe to the view that government should establish a special housing fund capped at 10% interest per annum. And a close 42% think that government through National Housing and Construction Corporation should focus on low-cost housing and let the private developers cater for the high income. And then 11% says that land prices should be regulated. Thank you so much for participating in this poll. And this brings us to discussant number 3, Mr. Sam Wabasa. Mr. Sam Wabasa is the Managing Director of Canaan Sites Limited and the Director, Makerere High School, Migade. Under his leadership at Canaan Sites, he has, together with his dedicated team, spearheaded the creation of over 8,000 privately owned housing units in over 60 organized housing estates around Kampala, Entebbe, Mukono, Wachiso. These housing settlements have amenities like privately drilled, clean piped water, roads, electricity, recreation spaces, and security provisions, among others. Mr. Wabasa has also served as a land surveyor in the Department of Physical Planning in the Ministry of Lands, Housing, and Urban Development under the GTZ project, and as field surveyor under Global Survey Team and engineers. He holds a diploma in land surveying and diploma in physical housing. Mr. Wabasa, you are welcome to speak to the discussion at hand today. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Paul. And my fellow discussants. I want to thank you, CASO, for organizing this very important topic at this time. It cannot be overemphasized. The pandemic has made a clear statement that we need houses, we need homes, we need settlements that can meet the standards to help us overcome the challenges. I want to thank the discussants and all that has been so far shared, but I want to let's look at the population that we are planning for, the population that we are discussing. When you make a close look at our population, you find that largely it is a population of young people. Our population of young people is about 77. But the other look at our population again, you find that we are largely still rural. The rural ends are carrying about 76% of the people, of Ugandans. But another closer look at the employment level of our biggest population, which is the young people, you find that they are largely unemployed. They are not engaged in meaningful employment. Between 18 to 24, we have over 83% of our younger people without engagements. So this one makes me look at this problem in this way. It looks our main problem in the lacking of affordable units and in lacking of decent settlements stems more at our low levels of disposable income across our population. The problem does not start at the lack of the units. It starts at our lack of ability to purchase them. I'm sure, as it has already been observed, the majority of the players currently are in the private sector. The mind of an investor here is about who can pay. It is about who can pay. The investor is looking at the ability of the population to pay. So most likely the investor is going to be going to the areas where the payers are. So if we are to tackle the issue nationally, I would think we had better tackle the issue of raising, together with other aspects, let us tackle the issue of considering to raise the levels of our disposable income across our population. And as we have already observed, it is a younger population, which is already big. Somebody calls it a challenge, but I think it is an opportunity. It is an energetic level of people that need to be oriented into proper energies of skills to have, to focus them. They are the owners of the houses that we are largely planning. Now, if 77% of our population are the youth, it means the small sector, what is left, and among which there is the other sector which is beyond the workforce. It is a smaller sector which is at play. And our turning key is at how we raise the levels of the disposable income of this sector. This one pushes me to our planning. Uganda is already a planning country, all of it. But a number of times when we talk about planning, the focus is on the urban. If we fail to focus on average levels, the incomes of our average people, our towns and urban centers will not do much. There is need to plan and have a clear flow, a harmonious flow of relationship economically. We need to stop focusing on the urban. I would deviate a bit from the debate of emphasis on Kampala, because in itself has been a problem. We have put everything on Kampala and it has affected the rest of the country. It has affected and demobilized the rest of the country from active involvement in the economy. We need to think more across the country than we have been doing before. Just like I'm saying, we need now to think of proper plans for the villages. We need to do proper plans for them because that's where the majority of the people are. If we are to run out of this shortage of houses, we need a higher level of disposable income. Our younger people, as we have seen, they are coming out with qualifications which are not matching with the skills that the jobs are demanding. Thank God for the government in the shift in our education to go skilling. This is the way to go. The way to go is to critically plan for the youth, critically plan for the rural ends, which are carrying the majority of our populations. The skilling bit will enable our young men to get fixed well in the job markets, but also it will increase our levels of output. When a Ugandan has money in the hands, the investor will flow in. The investor will flow in and build for them because now the investor is sure he has a buyer. We have this question of what's the most pressing housing problem. I think that it doesn't begin from the shortage of houses. It does also begin from the other shortages of affordable houses. It begins from who are we building for? Because the question is in the air. Who are we building for? And if that one is well addressed, and what is his capacity to pay for the house? If that is well addressed, the units, I believe, the levels of our housing will increase, the settlements will come up because they have who to pay. If you consider how the entire housing is happening today, as it has already been observed, it is in such a way that only the upper end is being considered. Let us also look at the issue of alternative building materials, which is already known. I want to say the uphill task here is to deal with the negative cultural attitude of our people. The negative cultural attitude of our people has been a blockage towards these efforts. As a player in the market, we've thought of many of these things, but the market largely, the people, even when they don't have the resources, they still consider mortar houses out of mortar cement as the most desirable house. They have refused to embrace quickly the alternative housing techniques and technologies, which would go a long way in helping us. So we have a task here to deal with the negative attitude of our people towards the alternative building materials as observed by Madam Patricia, the stones which are available everywhere and so on. We may bypass many of these things that make it very expensive. As she also observed, there is no need why we still have this backlog in the villages, because whatever is needed to put up the affordable houses in the villages is already there. What we need is now to work on the negative attitudes that is acceptable, so we can go and have more decent accommodation and more affordable. The issue of planning still, I come back to it. The physical planner in this nation is supposed to be ahead of everybody. And as I've said, Uganda, all of it is a planning country now. The villages are a planning country. It is no longer urban alone. So the planner, up to today, the developer is ahead of the planner. This has caused a big problem. By the time the planner comes, the developer has already done what is not supposed to be done. It is one of the major root of the unplanned settlements. I don't think the tenure system, the land tenure system, is any hindrance to a planner in this country, because there's enough legislation, enough law to enable the planner to plan on any tenure system. We need to look, we need government to come up with plans ahead of the planners. And I think this will go a long way in settling the issue of haphazard developments. That clear flow of plans from the village up to the urban centers, which I'm saying we need to have every urban center given a chance to grow, given a chance to accommodate its urban inflows, given a chance to create employment for its people, the inflows. It should be given a chance to have orderly settlements, just like it is in Kampala. Just like it is in Kampala. So the planning in this country, especially the physical planning, alongside the other plannings, should be at the forefront of this whole thing to avoid the situation of haphazard development and lack of proper units for our people.
Yes.
Some of the things that we have looked at as negative, I would think they are really positive. The world over, housing is being pushed forward by the private sector. Government's involvement of proper policies is good.
Yes.
But I think government should go ahead to bring these policies closer to the implementers, whom I think are largely the private sector. We have a lot of good plans in place, but the private sector has not accessed what these policies are and what they are saying. So can government, we need to have to encourage the government to make clear the policies that are in place, especially in this sector, before the developers, that more than having them as it has been the case.
Mr. Wabasa, you have a minute to conclude.
Okay, thank you. The funding, I think we need, I want to recommend that we need to avail more of development funds. The funds we have are largely commercial funds. But of course, also I've already said it, if we have people that can pick them, the issue is not about not accessing them. The issue is about funds that will not cause financing to be an expensive thing. We need more of development funds to be available to this sector. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Wabasa. Indeed, in one of your remarks towards the end, you mentioned that the developer is actually running ahead of the plan. That's an interesting scenario that we will come back to a bit later on. We would like to bring on our discussant number 4. Mr. Michael K. Mugabe is the Managing Director of Housing Finance Bank. Mr. Mugabe has served on the board of the Housing Finance Bank for over 4 years. He possesses over 20 years experience as a legal practitioner and as a banker as well, serving at various capacities in both professions. He is a fellow of the Chartered Institute of Chartered Secretaries and Administrators, United Kingdom, and he also serves as a council member at the Institute for Corporate Governance of Uganda. Michael holds a Master of Laws degree in Commercial and Corporate Law from the University of London, United Kingdom, a Bachelor of Laws Honours degree from Makerere University, Kampala, among other professional qualifications. He is also a qualified advocate of the High Court of the Republic of Uganda and other courts of judicature in Uganda. And Mr. Mugabe, thank you so much, together with the Housing Finance Bank, for sponsoring this particular webinar that is discussing housing and settlements. We do appreciate your sponsorship. And over to you, Mr. Mugabe. Kindly comment on the paper and the issue at hand. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Paul, our moderator this morning. A very good morning to you, all our listeners, our viewers. We are happy to share with you this morning on a matter that I consider to be extremely near and dear to our hearts, given the close proximity between housing, between shelter and humanity. Indeed, as other panelists and the keynote presenters said this morning, the need for housing has existed since humanity. And the urgency, the need has continued to build with increasing global population. Now in the height of 7 billion people. So we cannot overemphasize the need for housing, especially the migration from housing being a basic need, but a form of wealth creation and preservation and growth. So what do you see? What you see, really, you can see a hybrid of sparsely populated scattered houses and then concentrated houses in a part of Kampala. Here, this was taken, one picture, and the next one was taken in the suburb of Kampala. If you can move the next, and another was some form of some collected or gathered settlements. That's your Chira. That's Chira, I think, somewhere in Kampala here, and suburbs of Kampala. Next, you can see these are quite concentrated. Some planned, some unplanned. A bit of a planned area here. You can see utilities, you can see infrastructure, drainage. Again, what the panelists have alluded to, and these are the key things. So when we say lockdown, go home, these are the kind of issues that we are dealing with. A snippet of what our people are going back to. So COVID-19 impacted on us. How did it impact on us? If globally, the world economy contracted sharply by about 3%. And what does this mean for us? It's important that we understand that by the global economy contracting, the demand for our products, flowers, coffee, tea exports dropped completely, because with the reduction of income in these economies, the demand for exports with the lockdown restrictions, all this impacted significantly on our economy. Closer to the continent, about 80% of the business have been significantly impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. And ultimately, us as a country, Uganda, have also been impacted, whereas we had projected to grow in the highs of 6% GDP, one of the highest across the globe. We have, as a result of this COVID-19 lowered our projections, our growth projection. We shall grow, and I want us to make it clear, we shall grow, but not at the momentum and rate that we had projected to grow as an economy. And therefore, significantly impacting on aspects of housing, and I'll show later why. But before I show why, let me just give you a view of what it looks like. And I know many of you have alluded to, panelists have alluded to this. The gap remains, the deficit in housing is quite large, projected to go 3 million units for the next few years, and it increases at a rate of 200,000 units per annum. The mortgage portfolio, by the figures I have of 2019, had increased by 10%, one of the highest increase rates of growth. And this was largely driven by stable interest rates and good economic recovery. I'd also like to share with listeners and viewers, know if you slightly, the building and construction sector continues to take a major lead in terms of uptake of credits. So of the total private sector credit uptake, building and construction leads with about 20%. If you put agriculture, and these are from figures from the Bank of Uganda, if you take banking, agriculture, tourism, trade, the building and construction sector takes the lion's share of private credit uptake. We've seen interest rates declining over the last several years, the lows of 17. That's for mortgage. And this is what we are dealing with. So quite a bit of an active market for mortgage. If you can move to the next slide. How has COVID impacted on us? And I want to look at two aspects, the demand and supply side. In terms of income, in terms of the demand side, many of our people are involved in the informal sector. Many of our people are in the informal sector, and with the lockdown restrictions, incomes have been severely constrained. And this highly impacts on their purchase and affordability, on ability to purchase, on ability to acquire, on ability to be able to cause traction in this housing market. The diaspora, which has also played a very key role in the housing market, has also equally experienced restriction and therefore suddenly impacted on the demand for housing. Rentals, we've seen a moratorium on payment of rent. We've seen some back and forth between landlords and tenants, with rent income being a big issue, and therefore impacting on ability for developers to build more houses, to acquire funding, to be able to access to build more houses. So the demand for housing has contracted. On the supply side, we've seen expensive materials. Housing indeed is one of the sectors that has a very large, long value chain. So with the lockdown and restriction, we are seeing a high cost of materials that have in reaction also affected the price of houses. So we are seeing high prices of houses. We are seeing low demand for houses, and therefore ultimately affecting the whole market. Financing is again a big issue. First of all, we have a challenge of access. The cost of borrowing is very high, it's still very high, undoubtedly, and that has been able to do. You've seen the poll saying that should be, from the poll that you've just read, Paul, cost of funding being a big issue that the viewers and participants have rated as a big issue for us to address. And also liquidity. When you have savings impacted, ultimately liquidity gets impacted. So accessibility of cheap and affordable funding becomes a big issue if you're going to address housing. And for me here is a slide that sums it all. What can be done to spur growth in the housing market? Number one is income. Clearly, we need to support expansion of the real economy so that the incomes of households and businesses can be boosted to be able to cause traction in this housing market chain. Financing is another big issue with lockdown, with the restriction in business. this is a very big issue whereby the ability to continue to have traction in housing becomes a very big issue. And we've seen the Bank of Uganda coming in to urge commercial banks to offer moratoriums, flexible repayments of loans, and we are seeing restructuring of loans being the big activity that commercial banks are offering to customers to enable them manage the distress that COVID has bestowed upon us. So a big issue for us to address. Innovation, indeed, one of the key questions that the participants are forwarding to us is what innovation can be done. One, to be able to have affordable housing. We still see the cost of housing very, very high, but we recognize that there can be engagements with the technology gurus to be able to bring to the market the architects. How can we bring the cost of housing? And I think the technologies that involved in building become very important, and I'll go back to that when I talk about incentives. So that becomes a big issue for us. We need to be able to innovate new solutions and building technologies that will bring to the market cheap or affordable houses. Then financing. Financing is still a big issue. So reduction in interest rates become a big issue in terms of what can we do, and rated innovation in terms of efficiencies, digital. We are seeing social distancing, financial inclusion. Many people outside the reach of the banking, but yet they would like to benefit from the banking services and intermediation. This can only be done if we innovate solutions, digital and otherwise, that will bring services closer, as well as look for affordable means of funds so that we can bring housing within the reach of many Ugandans. Incentives, and indeed incentives is a big issue here. We need to harness incentives in terms of tax reduction on stamp duty for sale of properties, expedite refunds of VAT, but also look to give incentives to companies, startups that are especially technologies that are bringing to the market good solutions, or solutions that can reduce the cost of housing in this country. If through innovation we can have technologies that can bring to the market low cost housing, then those should receive incentives or repayment holidays that can enable the business to come up because of the demand that we think and we undoubtedly know is very good. Partnerships. Collaboration and partnerships is a key issue for us if we are going to address the gap in housing and the deficit that we speak to. We recognize housing as important, but there's lack of collaboration in terms of funders, developers, the housing association, the engineers, the architects, to be able to cause traction in terms of research, in terms of what can be done differently, in terms of the expansive housing value chain from the time of acquisition of land to planning through to development and other technologies that would help us to be able to bring the cost of housing down. This is very key. And then very lastly, review of the policy. And for me, review of the policies extends not just to an accommodative policy that allows us or that produces a conducive environment for housing to thrive. No, for me, it goes beyond that to really to even also to the local authorities. For instance, a 2-bedroom house goes through the same stages of approval as a 3-floor building. In terms of, so how can we then, if we are saying that we are looking to causing a traction in this area, how can we shorten, how can we lower the span, how can we create traction in this area? And we can only do that if we bring to bear some of these key attributes that can cause a closure in this housing value chain. And I think we can do that through collaboration and engagement. And those are my few remarks, moderator. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mugabe. Indeed, you've highlighted a number of things around across the broad discussion we've had, and commented as well about innovations and financing. We'll be coming back to that issue. Actually, it's going to be the next issue. But before we get into anything else, we'd like to take our third poll question and kindly respond to these poll questions, dear attendees of this webinar. And I also encourage the panelists to look in the Q&A section. There's a lot there that needs to be responded to. And the poll question reads, which of is the most challenging factor in planning the future of human settlements? Which of these is the most challenging factor in planning the future of human settlements? 1, rapid migration to cities. 2, the complex land tenure system. 3, shortage of land. 4, prohibitive cost of finance or prohibitive cost of housing finance. I avoided housing finance because I didn't want it to be misunderstood for the company being represented on the webinar today. So your responses to which of these is the most challenging factor in planning the future of human settlements? Rapid migration to cities, complex land tenure systems, shortage of land, prohibitive cost of finance. I kindly make your views known on that poll question because we want to hear from you and what you think about that. We will shortly be going into the engagement of some of the questions and comments that have been made, as well as other questions that will come up and that we may have already on our record. So shortly get ready for that. We expected to have the minister, the state minister in charge of this sector, but we hope that there will be some representation shortly. Now, in terms of the results of the poll, 42% believe that it's the prohibitive cost of finance, followed by a close 36%, the complex land tenure system, and then 19% who subscribe to rapid migration to cities, and then 3% which speaks to a shortage of land. Thank you so much for participating in this poll, and we will be moving into the next phase of the discussion, which is going to be the public discussion for this webinar. Kindly keep your commentaries coming through. And I'd like to kick this off with a question that is represented by something that has cut across this discussion. And this is speaking majorly to innovations. And I would like Mr. Rubongoya to comment on this, and then any other panelist. The question from Mili Rwanga, which when I read through these questions is represented by many others. I'll read 2 questions and combine them. It says, I would like to know whether we can adopt building methods of using wood and board instead of brick and cement to quicken the building process and flexibility for low-income earners. The same question was asked by, I believe it was Miriam Mutabazi, and she presented a challenge. She says that as I considered building with bamboo, I was discouraged with the reason that insurance would not give me coverage for my home. What is your comment on this? I know that architect Patricia Rutiba already answered, and I will read her response, but I would still need this discussion to be held here. Our building standards are very old. They have never been updated to include many materials that are readily available, mainly because these materials have not been formally tested. UNBS approved or standardized for use in terms of strength, size, thickness to be used for specific building elements. The solution is to combine bamboo with other approved materials and prove over time that the material works. Lodges made out of bamboo in game parks are insured this way. Please note that fire detection, alarm, and fighting installations play a big role. But Mr. Rwongoya, what is your take on this particular question asked when you note that this question is repeated in many different ways on this forum?
Thank you, Paul. Professor Kojo did mention that our country may never grow an inch bigger. We'll remain that 240 something square kilometers. Our density population per square kilometer currently stands at around 183 persons per square kilometer. In about 30 years to come, 2050, it is slated to rise to 840, thereabout, persons per square meter. It is imperative that we contend with settlements that will be able to house that growth. It is important to note that while we are talking about hundreds and we are finding challenges, countries like Singapore, like we mentioned, naturally it is only 500 square kilometers. They've reclaimed some sea and now they measure around 740. They have contended with high population densities and being able to accommodate them. In which case, whatever solution we think about should be able to allow us to accommodate our population. And so we are advocating at CASO for vertical densification. I think even Ministry of Housing has come up with densities, recommendations of how to accommodate densities in different settlements. We should be very careful. The materials we advocate for should be price sensitive, should allow us speed to cope with the backlog, and they should allow us to move vertically. We cannot, continue this urban sprawl with expanding horizontally. And the challenge is that we must think about, materials that allow us to go vertically. I hope that answers your question, Paul.
And to some extent, do you have any recommendations of such materials?
Yes, we do. We do, and unfortunately, the time does not allow. But we've researched on some materials, and CASO we will put them in our recommendations. These have been tested. They have been tested for seismic, pressures. They've been tested all standards, and would like to engage the government how it can facilitate through PPPs for people to invest, and then we can, see how that can help in addressing this question.
Thank you so much, Patrick. And to Architect Patricia, you responded to that question about bamboo, but the question raises a very salient point on insurance in relation to these new materials. And you made a couple of comments. If you could kindly discuss a little bit deeper on the issue of upcoming materials. It could be wood. One of the discussants mentioned, not discussants, the Q&A questions talked about wood. In my preliminary comments, I talked about wood. I commented about gypsum board and generally these. But the question of insurance, how do we address this issue in a more practical way?
Practically, I think insurers are looking for some kind of confidence in the structure that you're putting up. And this comes with items or materials that have been tried and tested over time, and they've been proved to be safe. They've been proved to be, fire safe. And when we talk about wood, insurers, all the antennas go up because they are now worried about fires. And yet materials like gypsum, stone, which are readily available, will be able to resist fires. So if you use gypsum in combination with wood, for example, if you're doing a wooden structure, and then you use gypsum in the areas that have fire, maybe like the kitchen for the ceiling, and then don't expose the thatch, don't expose the wood, then you have protected in some way. Plaster also protects, but it has cement inside. So we are looking for solutions that can help insurers to have more confidence in the building that you're putting up. So as Patrick said, the tests have been done on some of these materials, but then, for example, the UNBS, our standards body, may not have done their own tests on these. And maybe that is what the insurers are looking for, if they can get confirmation from, material labs that have tested the materials and they're okay with them. Certain strengths of bamboo can be used structurally, others can only be used decoratively. And this has to be very clear, because if these are not standardized for use, you find that the wrong elements, maybe smaller pieces of bamboo or timber, are being used for structural purposes, and yet they are not strong enough because they've not been tested and specified for that. You find that you can endanger the people who are going to use that building, and insurers will not be comfortable about that. But if we can have those confirmations done, standardization is properly done, even the local authorities are knowledgeable enough about these materials, they are educated and taught and shown, and then building laws are also adjusted to include those materials, then there'll be overall confidence about the use of these materials. Why I mentioned fire protection is that it's very critical for a building to be insured. All those installations have to be in place. So if you have them, then you've also done the termite treatment and you're going to do the maintenance over time, then you can give the insurers confidence practically that they can trust. I also talked about combining materials. If we learn how to combine some of the heavier duty materials with some of the proposals that are coming up, new concepts, then we'll be able to engage the public to accept some of these materials. At the moment, if you put up an all wood structure, unless it's in the game park, people will be scared to live in it, permanently. Yeah, so that is my take on the issue.
Thank you so much, Patricia. It kind of leaves another question lingering. How practical are these materials in our tropical environment? You've mentioned the issue of termites, and that's a big one. One of the biggest woods you can use would maybe be eucalyptus. But how do you deal with the termite issue? How do you deal with tropical? Are these practical options for us, or these other more practical options?
First of all, for wood is very varied. We have a lot of wood in Uganda. We have varied types, and some of them are more resistant than others. But what we need to do is get all these, Patrick mentioned sponsorship by government of research into the different materials, because even wood protection is viable here. We have some buildings at Makerere University, wooden buildings that have been there for many, many decades, and they are still fine because they were treated extremely well against termite infestation. And now the level of treatment that is done nowadays, unless you're dealing with very ethical people, the wood is treated very, they kind of smear some treatment on top and they say, okay, this timber is treated, please take it. But the actual quality of the treatment process and the seasoning has to be very good for us to use wood, even just, inside for furniture and for framing and for roof frames. So I feel that we need to develop our systems to be able to make materials standard for use to the level where they can be trusted. In other places, they've done that. Also, practical materials like stone. If people are not comfortable with wood because of issues like wood rot, and then our damp conditions, we have a lot of stone. But how many buildings in Kampala are built out of stone? Very few, because that area has also not been explored much. But we have quarries, and we've noted that these Chinese also, as they come and do our roads and see the stone, they ferry it out of the country because they know a million ways to use that stone that we are not using it for. Sorry, we're not using. So we need to be able to explore, test, research, develop, add value, and then we shall see a big difference even in the quality of buildings going up today.
Thank you so much, Patricia. Now, Dr. Charles Kojo, you mentioned a number of very interesting things in your discussion. I will begin with the area where we are letting off on these new, or not exactly new materials, and following up on the comment that Patricia just made, that now you have somebody saying that they are treating wood and they give you wood that's not properly treated. She also gave us an example of buildings in Makerere University that have been made of wood that indeed have been there for decades. How do we make this work for Uganda? Dr. Charles, are you still with us?
Yes, are you hearing me?
Yes, we can now hear you.
Very interesting question. And maybe I'll talk from two perspectives. I personally am growing bamboo in Hoima. So some of these are very practical. Bamboo is stronger than steel. This is the first thing when you go into a construction school, in the building school plannings, they talk about bamboo. So Uganda has the best opportunity. It has the chances of hitting 10, 20 stones with one aspect if you talk about technology, and for this case, bamboo. Patricia, bamboo, when treated, can last for a long time. The starting point is to ensure that our people, with all our vast land, with all the good climate, with all the benefits from the bamboo, it can make a very, very big chance in construction. I was in Ethiopia personally. They are using bamboo for construction. First of all, it's very beautiful. It can bend, the strength can change at all different various in construction. So the opportunities for bamboo are very high. For a household, just imagine every household or a settlement, if they had 5 bamboo around themselves, they can use it for firewood. Because about settlements, you need energy. Settlements, you need for construction, for things like small things around your home, for cows, for pegging, for animals. Bamboo itself can be able to be used as one of the best carbon sequencing and absorption of carbon. It's one of the areas as a policy, which is now becoming very, very critical and is accepted and agreed world over. It can do a lot of environmental ecosystems restorations. So in construction, in a settlements, in a homestead, the amount of energy being used. Look at scaffolding. The close trees, there are even huge bamboo, which can be used as piped water for piping systems, for carrying water. So the issue of the materials, construction, I think we need to discuss the whole day, but the bamboo and other sources of material which are available here are very critical and can be used for our housing and settlements. This is what I can say about really. We can invest currently, for maybe people to know, in Moyo, they are doing treatment of bamboo using impregnated treatment plant, which was given by the Chinese government. They are treating the bamboo. And personally, those who are interested can come to Hoima. I have about 250 acres of bamboo, 3 years old. So next 1 year, I'll be doing construction materials of bamboo. So it's practical. It's practical.
It's good to hear such encouraging news.
If you go to URI, Uganda Industrial Research Institute, you'd see the use of materials from bamboo, of making tiles, of making cupboards, of all these furniture things we talk about, households, settlements. They are all there. They are even importing from other countries. So we have substitute imports which can be easily here and locally. It's one of planting, 4 years, it's mature, it goes for another 100 years, some bit of bamboo. This is how sustainable it is. Most of the world are moving towards bamboo. So there's opportunities.
Thank you, Dr. Charles. Still on this question, how would you comment on the alignment of our technical and vocational skills to deal with these materials like bamboo in construction? Can you kindly comment on that?
First of all, in the training of the technical colleges, I've just said URI, Uganda Industrial Research Institute, is a very good incubator. The housing institutions should be able to invest in research, in technology, in increasing the usage, so that people can be able to understand that this thing is possible. So even at a very, very local level, than even going to high-level technical colleges, people can be able to understand the uses. Once we demonstrate, I'll be very happy for the mine director of national housing Michael Mugas to do a pilot demonstration of a bamboo house in one of these cities. It would be very, very amazing. People would be surprised to see how a bamboo construction is very, very important. So we are really importing one of these materials. I mean, look at we're talking about 20, 30 million people in Uganda. If they could be able to see, understand, having all this land, we can go far ahead to try and solve the issue of some of the construction materials in this country.
Thank you, Dr. Charles. And I think, Mr. Mugabe, a challenge has been leveled to you. But I will ask a follow-up question, actually, so that you can come in and comment. A lot of the commentaries in the chat room and the Q&A have intimated on financing, and indeed each and every one of the panelists. It is apparent that the cost of financing for housing in Uganda is relatively high. What is your take on that, and what can be done to deal with that issue of financing? Michael, kindly unmute your microphone. Okay, thank you. Oh, you're still muted.
Okay. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Paul, for that question. The cost of funding, and I raised it in my slide. The demand from low incomes, which affects eligibility, the supply of houses that comes, but now also funding for housing. What informs funding? Basically three sources. I would mention three. Number one is the costs. We source this money expensively. Availability of affordable long-term funding is a challenge. And that's why you see in the poll question, the participants said if we can get funds capped at 10, so availability of long-term cheap sources of funds is still a very big challenge, because remember, lending for mortgage is long-term. Business lending is 3 years and it's very short for your banker. So that's okay. But now long-term funding, so long-term mortgages are long-term in nature, 20 years. It becomes a challenge if you're going to get money that's expensive at 14%, at 10%. Then the other aspect that informs cost of funding is default. This default, you see, feeds into the price that banks carry, and they load it. And the default rate has been in the highs of 5, so between 5, 4, 6, and that's rather high. That's also is built into the cost of funding that really is reflected by the customer, and then cost of operations. So that's why, one, if we can work towards arranging good, affordable funding to be a good thing. And one of them is deposits. Ugandans, we don't have a culture of deposits, but of saving. But if we put money in the bank, that's money deposits that are available. And that's why I spoke to technologies, digital innovation that brings more people within the banking space, so that we have many people banking, and through good sources of funds, we're able to pull the sources together and to lend. So if we're able to manage funding, then manage technology by having efficiencies, reduce the cost of running a branch. We know we don't need a branch, we need technology. What we need banking, but we don't need a branch. So we can, and that's why the intervention can happen through digital. And the other is managing credit. Then we'll be able to address that aspect. But the key thing is funding. I know that another aspect that has come in, which I can mention here, is treasury bills. Risk-free money is 12% high. That makes it a bit of a challenge. So if I can put money in a treasury bill and that's risk-free, and I get it back, then lending it at 17 and with risks of default becomes a big challenge. So many things inform pricing, but those three are key. And energies, initiatives, working together to gather money together so that we can have cheap sources of funding tailored for housing as a key, since one of the factors that feed into the real economy, it would substantially reduce. And if we're able to get many funds available, especially the low and middle income, it would help us to alleviate the problem of housing in this country. And that's why I say technologies are good. Yes, we must address supply so that the price of houses goes down, but funding is a big issue which we think we can address. And we're engaging key stakeholders. We are engaging funders as housing finance to try and get funds that is tailored to the low and middle income people in our country. And we believe that's where we need to play a big role that we believe will be impactful and will touch the lives of many Ugandans. Especially COVID has helped to even further augment that. I think Paul have addressed a bit of that.
Thank you, Michael. This question that Charles, sorry, Patrick, go ahead.
Yeah, it's not necessarily, that is spot on, the issue of funding. But I think globally, the issue of affordable housing is largely misunderstood. Strictly speaking, affordable housing refers to houses that can fall within 30% of one's earning. So if you consider that averagely, 1 million, so you are looking whether you are renting or buying, you should be able to rent or service a mortgage with around 300. So working backwards, what type of house are we talking? And when you look elsewhere, governments have, arrangements like social housing. They have rebates. They have zones for low-income earners. So it's not a question, and I think Mr. Wabasa alluded to it. You cannot, it's a fact of, economics and earnings. And for you to really afford, you must do something drastically. And we are proposing at CASO different approaches. For instance, in Denmark, they have what they call co-housing or group housing. This brings down the cost of housing, cooperative housing. So we need to look at the whole spectrum and opportunity and available opportunities to answer this question. It cannot be only raising people's incomes, because that's a fact of the economy. You cannot change it overnight. And yet the problem is with us, and it must be attended to. We cannot wait for people's incomes to raise to a level to afford what is being constructed the way it's being constructed.
Thank you so much, Mr. Rubongoya. And Michael, I'll just kind of leave something for you to mull over as we get into the next poll question, and then after that you will respond to it. There was an issue of partnership with innovation institutions. What do you reckon that the financial services sector can do to partner with development of affordable housing? So that's something that will come back to you about once we are done with the poll question. I'm requesting the team that is running the admin to post our next poll question. And the question reads, do you expect improvements in the state of housing and human settlements arising from the creation of the new cities? Do you expect improvements in the state of housing and human settlements resultant from the creation of the new cities? The answers is purely yes, no, or it is subject to the quality of a national metropolitan authority. Do you expect improvements in the state of housing and human settlements arising from the creation of the new cities? And in the next about 10 seconds, we will be ending the poll. Kindly have your say on that. Do you expect improvements in the state of housing and human settlements resultant from the creation of the new cities in Uganda? Thank you so much. We will end our poll. We're giving a few people a little bit to respond. And the result is 45% of us do not expect that creation of new cities will improve the state of housing and human settlements in Uganda. And 26% believes that that move will help improve that state. And there is a 29% that thinks that it is subject to a national metropolitan authority. So the majority of us do not think that creating new cities will improve the state of housing and human settlements in Uganda. And that is something that is quite of a paradigm to think about. Mr. Mugabe, back to you and your comments on partnership between financial institutions, educational institutions, and innovation hubs towards developing of affordable housing. Over to you, sir, for your comment.
Thank you very much, Paul. Very interesting question here. And I want to agree with you and the question that, and to bring the participants and the listeners closer to the scene, especially particularly for housing finance, which I'll speak for, is that about 3 years ago, we partnered with the engineering department, Makerere, Faculty of Technology, to challenge, as a challenge of plans in terms of what we can do to address the issue of affordable housing. And in terms of, because it begins with a plan, and that's why I'm happy that on this webinar we have architects, the whole cost of what feeds into the cost of affordable housing. In terms of, we want a low cost housing. So the issue of key stakeholders in the whole value chain it becomes very key and imperative. And in this particular case, innovation then becomes very key and major. And where is innovation? Innovation is in the innovation hubs and in the universities and tertiary schools where there's a lot of traction and studies, research, especially in the, see that we can come up with technologies, innovation that could drive or spark traction in that creation of affordable housing. What has been some of the challenge? I know that some technologies here, building technologies have been tried and Ugandans have rejected. Ugandans, that the walls are thin, especially in this, for instance, the usage of prefabs was rejected. So we could, through these engagements with governments and other key stakeholders, we could improve awareness so that we have our people looking to appreciate these new technologies and as well as engaging several innovators in the space with the objective of delivering affordable models of housing units in this country. It is something that I welcome and it's something that we are passionate about as Housing Finance Bank. It's something we need to do and do more at a greater scale. Because, and I think the keynote Patrick alluded to it, the keynote speaker alluded to it, the cost affordable, you see there is financing, but also there is availability in terms of the supply side. And Paul, that's I think where you're coming from. In terms of the supply side, a house is completed and what informs it? You know, a house is completed at a very astronomical price that is outside the reach of many Ugandans, outside the salary bracket of many Ugandans. So how do we do this? And yet our passion is to reach out to as many Ugandans as possible to access funding, to access housing. And one way could be interventions in the supply and demand side. And in the supply side, I think partnership, collaboration, strategic partnerships with innovation hubs, with think tanks, with and what exactly what we are discussing here, which is being recorded and documented. All of them become very pivotal for us to address this challenge. It's a big challenge. And we've not done, for me, I think we are scratching at it. Not much has been done. Even when you talk about technology, even awareness, even spreading them, even, you know, even having a models like what Architects has challenged me too. So I think we need to do more of that. Financial institutions and better dig in and take a deep dive and have these partnerships if we are going to cause traction. And that's Housing Finance Bank. I want to assure us that that's something we are very passionate and we'll continue to take a lead and champion. Probably do at a more scale for us to be able to cause traction or visible results all over. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Michael, on that submission. I think the discussion, I need to alter it a bit to begin speaking to policy issues because, again, many of the questions in the Q&A are intimating and hinting on issues that border on policy and enforcement of policy. There is a question by Herbert Kakiza, which, a comment actually, we need to plan and manage all form of waste. Waste management has to be done both for urban and rural populations. And there's a number of them that are in here. Taistas Asimwe asks a question which incidentally is addressed more to the policy issue. Uganda has perhaps the most confusing land tenure systems. And also the largest chunk of our land is untitled. This has continuously affected land security, which is a very important aspect in housing development. I wanted the Honorable Minister to tell us what government is doing about this. Then let me see if there's been quite a few of them, but coming to you, Mr. Wabasa, as a developer, you spoke some very interesting statistics. You attribute your different engagements to have provided at least 8,000 different housing opportunities to Ugandans and people in Uganda. But both yourself and Dr. Charles mentioned a concept which I had not thought much about until today, of rural planning. The concept of rural planning. How can we practically move Uganda into that direction? Because the average Ugandan looks at their village and according to them, there's still a lot of land to develop. But kindly speak to us, how do we practically move into the space of rural planning as a country? Mr. Wabasa, can you unmute your microphone? You're still muted, sir.
Okay. Is that okay?
Okay. Yes, you're okay now.
Yes. Rural planning is just as much needed as urban planning. It may just take a little bit of different considerations, but in the end, it is a planning that will help have healthy villages where most of our population, as I was saying, do reside. We are still largely rural. So emphasizing urban planning alone and ignoring the rural planning will not help us. Even the inflow of people, because why are people moving from the villages? Some of the things that inform their movement is look for better lifestyles, which they expect to find in town. But with good planning in the rural ends, looking at, for example, if we had planned the entire nation, Mr. Kojo was talking about the cattle, and if we had to consider what can a given place do best, because we have the records as government, we have the statistics of what each given area has as its potential. And we go ahead and do a planning around what they are naturally endowed with and what they can be done, such that we give a more emphasis in our planning in the areas where we think they are well endowed and they can easily earn a decent living, which will finally translate into a good lifestyle, affording enough a house and affording life in all the other aspects of life. So that is what I'm meaning by rural planning. And then linking these well-planned villages with their urban centers. So there's a health relationship. When you produce in the village, you sell in the town, and the people in the town have the capacity to buy, and you have the capacity to produce good things that are marketable in the next urban center. Today, almost every village is producing for Kampala. It is common to find everything being produced everywhere in the country. The rush is towards Kampala because there is that mishap in the planning, the local planning between the village ends and their local ends. The other one is what is rural planning, which I'm talking about. We could go back and enable them, if I may go more practical. We could enable our rural ends there are things that are no longer in place, but with proper planning, it would enable them. What we need to look critically, what is really crippling our people in the village? They are producing, but where is the market? Of course, when you are planning for the end, the rural end, the elements change. We look at exactly what is they are doing, economical and so on. So where are their markets? Where are their markets? You look at a place like in the East, people are stranded with their produce. So we need to plan as government and enable these people to carve bigger entities that can be, to come into bigger entities that can do better bargaining for markets like it used to be. It used to be that these people were well planned. They had cooperative unions, for example, that had better say in the markets. Some of them, after producing their smaller quantities, since they are not well planned and coordinated, they can't bargain for this kind of market. So they are stuck with their smaller quantities. But put together into proper planning is a bigger quantity that can attract better prices and better prices and bigger markets put together. And when you do that, the whole country, even the nation can be able to talk. As a country, we can be able to also access better markets when we are sure we have what to market. So rural planning should be, according to me, should be emphasized because we have many people there and they are not doing as well because we have not interacted. What I would call coordinated interventions by government in planning. It's a liberal market, it's a capital economy, but coordinated, should be more coordinated by the government to put all this together that we can have better meaning for our ends.
Paul, can I come in a bit here? I'm
yes,
sorry.
Patrick, please go ahead.
This way of asking to come in. You ask how this can be, brought on board. You realize that the ministry that is very concerned with ours is Ministry of Lands, Housing and Urban Development. When you look at other governments, they emphasize the bit of rural and regional planning. In fact, if you interrogate the planning acts of the East African countries, you will see that our planning act needs to be, upped. And having said that, you need to also notice that the rural, problems are a bit unique. As we speak, it is also going rapid fragmentation. Where I come from, I think the average land holding is about 1.5 acres. And yet we still have this inheritance law where practice where we die and subdivide our land. That needs to be arrested. And there's also one thing we don't like talking about, the way we bury our loved ones. And the types of scattered settlements, which is impeding on land for food production. It is very important that rural planning is given its own stand as part of the government. And maybe we can borrow a leaf from how other governments are structured. This morning, we probably didn't explain ourselves. In my presentation, I wanted to emphasize Kampala as an overarching strategy, like other countries have done. But that is not to negate the fact that the needs are way and beyond the city that we're talking about. It is just as a strategy. So at CASO, we are emphasizing, especially that the country has been declared or was since declared a planning nation. It is imperative that the act is brought up to speed. One such act that is inadequate is one that has delegated the planning act to the district level. I doubt whether at the district level, a constitution of the planning, department is up to the game and that delegation by that act is effective.
Thank you, Patrick. I'll be coming back to Mr. Wabasa shortly on two critical questions, but just to share an experience I had 5 years ago when I visited the UK. I met a gentleman who was in charge of cartographing the UK again. And he spoke to us and told us that the entire UK has been cartographed on a 3D level up to the last foot. So that's all part of feed into planning and things that we need to think about. But Patrick, you mentioned for the second time on this webinar of Uganda being referred to as the planning nation. How do we move away from planning to enforcement? What is the things that we need to do as a country to move away from planning and discussing and policy to enforcement? In fact, some people commentators have said that if you want a good plan, go to Uganda, then you go and implement it elsewhere.
Well, thank you, Paul. But as I mentioned before, that pronouncement should be reflected in the government structure. We cannot at the ministerial level remain focused at urban when the planning is declared all over. It's a misnomer. Secondly, we need tools. If you go to the Department of Mapping and Surveying, in planning, you need both. You need UBOS, you need the Department of Mapping and Surveying to give you information to be able to plan effectively. 1975, as early as 1975, a regional body to help us contend with that challenge was formed in Kenya. It's in Nairobi, premised in Kasarani. The Regional Resource Center for Mapping for Development. You should see the reporting therein. We have not taken advantage of that body. And almost 50 years down the road, should we continue operating that far? Or it is high time that we brought a department here, or we upped the game of mapping and surveying. In other words, the government's facilitation should also be the one that provides, enabling facilities that are required to, handle this job. I've mentioned also the issue of housing finance being reoriented, National Housing Corporation being reoriented to their initial missions, equally Shelter Freak, which was created to help this housing issue. We need to be interrogating what are our benefits. Should we start our own bank? Should we have a branch here? We've interrogated the last 10 financial reports. It is alarming that we get the tail end of these important agencies that will be speaking into our challenges. For instance, the Resource Center for Mapping, all I have seen there is taking our instruments for repair, probably a ministerial visit, but these must play their central role in helping us to plan this country as a whole.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. Back to you, Mr. Wabasa. In your contribution, you made the statement that the developer is ahead of the planner. How do we narrow that gap?
It still goes back to some of the steps between policy and implementations, and making sure that the policies that we come up with as a nation have got clear roadmaps for implementation. In so doing, we'll be narrowing some of these gaps where the developers seem to be ahead of the planners. We need planning systems that are looking ahead before things happen. For example, we are crying about the many slums that surround us. But we have a good example of the Namuwongo housing estate. One time, Namuwongo was not the way it is. Namuwongo was something as bad as any of the slums we have. A resource was put up and a better housing settlement emerged. A better housing settlement emerged. And it was not a free, it didn't emerge freely. It wasn't a donation. People came in and supported the program, and once upon a time, a bad slum became a better settlement where people could come in with their resources. We could continue in planning to do the same around Kampala. Years between when Namuwongo existed up to now, I'm sure many of these slums could have been removed. It is just the initial money that settles the landlords and disengages the people that they are on, and other development will take place, and we won't be looking at the slums as they are. But it didn't proceed, and all it requires is planning. I mean, to go ahead and cause the planning to exist. The planners must, I imagine, the planners must really show government what needs to be done. The planners must move ahead and engage government on their plans and hang them up and debate for them and cause them to be implemented. Government is baffled with many things. I think that's what I'm saying, that to narrow the thing, let the planner be more proactive, be more, up to the task, as I've already given that example. We could have a program that eradicates all these slums out of Kampala. We could do that. We are not lacking much other than the real plans and the roadmap to have them out of the way.
Thank you, Sam. Another question for you is, considering the fact that growth of the Ugandan economy is averaged at around 5% for the last decade, according to the World Bank, is it right to argue that land prices should continue going up? You're a developer in this space. What is causing these land prices to keep going up even when the economy is growing at that rate of 5% on average?
It stems right back from our constitution. As you are aware, land belongs to the people of Uganda. And even government does not have land. It is the local people, it is the citizens that have the land. Under all those tenures, most of it is held by the people. And so what does that mean? We're in a situation where people bring the land to the market as and when they feel like. That's when they bring it to the market. They sell for their own reason. They bring it on the market for their own reasons and at their price. So it is a major problem that cannot easily be changed until maybe the constitution is revisited. But there we are. And as you know already, there are already different tenure systems depending on the region you are discussing. Some of these tenure systems have been there for so long that touching them it turns out to be a political issue. So I don't see really land markets changing much because of that, because government, which would have done something, is not in charge of the land. The government doesn't own the land. Yeah, all government would have done maybe is, which I think it is in the power, as I said, irrespective of the tenure system, government can hang up a program or a plan, and whoever owns land in that area should conform according to the plan that maybe KCCA has put up or the Department of Fiscal Planning has put up. So you do your plans according, it is okay you have the land, but you should do your plans according to what we have said. This is what has to be done here, land use zoning, and you stick to it, and you could even go ahead to give details where possible of how things should run. And the owners of the land should conform. As you do that, it would be a way of maybe regulating the prices, because now there will be clear patterns of development. People would be involving themselves with an expectation of what will be happening. It can go a long way in regionalizing the market as opposed to now, and also to secure people's development as to be predictable. One could easily predict what would be happening in the neighborhood because the plan is already up, as opposed to this mixed land use everywhere, which we are seeing, and also the prices which are rampant because the land is in the hands of the people.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sam. There is some questions here, Patricia, that I'm going to read out and comments. Then I will ask a follow-up question. Martin Barungi says, so the issue of affordable rent, especially for young people, becomes an important agenda. And then Herbert Kakiza has a comment or a question. What is the place of culture and gender in all of this? But the actual question, Patricia, with those perspectives in, is according to Vision 2040, the government expects that by 2030, it shall ensure access to all, for all to adequate, safe, affordable housing and basic services and upgrade slums. Now, 2030 is 10 years away. We've talked a bit about the planning issues and a number of other things. Is this a realistic expectation, or once again, we might miss a target? And what can be done to improve achievement of this goal in your view? Kindly comment on that. Hello, Patricia, your microphone is muted.
Thank
Yes,
you, I've unmuted it. I think realistic is relative. If we mean that by that time we'll have started walking into that direction, then that is realistic. But if it means by then we'll have reached, our goal and achieved everything, 10 years is not a very long time. It actually flies. But I think the things we need to take into consideration every time we talk about land tenure and the fact that it is impeding a lot of this progress, it is seen as a disadvantage, and yet it could actually be an advantage. In other countries where the government owns the land, when they do public housing, they own the housing, okay? If the people who are getting the houses are not contributing towards it financially, maybe using their savings like they did in Singapore, the government actually owns the houses. So if you maybe die, your family can be, taken out of the houses. Although some have taken measures to protect their people, to the extent that in South Africa, if you're going to be evicted from a particular property, that eviction notice will not be granted by the judge unless the government has an alternative place to house whoever is going to be evicted. So for Uganda to get to that level where it even has alternative housing, maybe someone is being taken out of this house, but there's backup housing for them. For us to get there, there has to be some collaboration between government and landowners. Like someone mentioned, if you own the piece of land, then you're obliged to follow planning regulations. But not only that, government can actually partner with you in co-owning whatever development will come up on that land, whether it is housing for the area zoned for housing or industrial for the area zoned for industrial. There's nothing wrong with government partnering with landowners to actually develop. The stake of the landowner in that equation would be they've contributed the land. And this would actually propel Ugandans even further. It creates wealth for the Ugandans because if, for example, an estate is being put up, government cannot do maybe 1,000 units because of land restrictions. But if there's a whole mile of land owned by 2 landlords or 3 landlords out of town, then government can partner with them, do the development, and then they have a stake. we have many lawyers and financial advisors and consultants who can actually work out those agreements. It brings wealth back to the people. It also gives people a stake in the developments going on. So they also work towards protecting them instead of fighting against them. So there are people who are very, they're lacking financially. They cannot even put up a single structure on their land, but they have a lot of land. They just don't have the money to develop the land. So why isn't there that partnership with the people who have the land and the ones who have the resources, like government or other developers, so that you have an agreement where all these housing units will come up, 500,000 units, and the owners of the land also have a stake. Some of them, some of the agreements even give a few units to the owners of the land to compensate them for the land. But at least the units have gone up and the housing, has been done. So in that sense, there are many things that we can do. They are right before us, but we need political will. We need even the social will, the social, that push to urge, to call our leaders to accountability, to call them to contribute towards this kind of collaboration. And I think if we do that, then even the whole issue of getting these materials standardized will not be a problem. We'll be able to do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Patricia. And a quick comment on the following question, then I'll have some comment on it before I bring this to a wrap with the last question that I'll be taking to Mr. Mugabe. But this question is to you, Patricia and Sam. It has been said that a healthy body is a healthy mind. But I noticed that sports, recreation, and entertainment are not part of the Ugandan settlements paradigm. How do we turn that around? I'll give you an example. In my neighborhood, there used to be a sports field that was being used by the community. It had been given by the previous landowner's family until a developer came and convinced that family to take the field back, and they have developed it into an estate. How do we deal with the Ugandan paradigm in terms of providing for sports, recreation, and entertainment? Patricia then will have some comment on this. You're still muted, Patricia.
Hello, sorry, my network kind of went off, sorry.
The question was, did you hear the question?
Yes, I had up to the point where that field was developed into an estate, yet it could have been a recreational space.
Yes. So
was
how
there anything after that?
No. The idea is to hear from you. How do we turn around this paradigm where sports, recreation, and entertainment are part of the important things in the Ugandan settlements paradigm?
This is very critical at planning level because the authorities above us can actually dictate. They have the power to dictate certain areas of every development that are dedicated towards recreation and even greenery. Our friend Dr. Charles talked about the environment a lot. And green cities have a beauty about them. Whenever you dedicate spaces in every development to greenery, to spaces where people can actually relax, to parks, all those spaces have a positive impact on they make the living environment healthier. Those are the spaces that will pull people outside to take walks. If you don't have those green areas and fields, it is very difficult to incentivize people to come out and do exercises in the parking lot, which is paved. But if it's a green park and it has all these trees and paths and walkways, then it is easier to give people the incentive to come out and become actually healthier. So it needs to be part of the planning process. Even as architects, as planners, when we are doing the plans, we do detailed neighborhood plans. They should have all those spaces catered for. Even in a compound, there's a limit to how much space you can develop on a plot. If it means going up so that you can have some greenery, you can actually move a floor up in order to have a bit of compound on your land. Because that is the only way that we can be able to get people to come outside. Human beings are not incentivized by tarmacs paving yards or paved yards to actually come out and exercise. It is the greenery that pulls them out. So that would create healthier environments.
Thank you,
if that was
Patricia.
enforced, if we had that that inspection and enforcement.
Thank you, Patricia. Mr. Wabasa, your quick comments on that one before we move over to Mr. Mugabe. Your microphone is still muted, Sam.
Is it okay?
Yes, you're okay now. Go right ahead.
I think let us now and on avoid completely piecemeal planning. There's a lot of piecemeal planning in practice today. As piecemeal planning is where we consider so and so and so and so in isolations. As I said, let us have detailed plans that capture real sizable places of land, because if you do piecemeal planning now, you cannot be planning recreation for every small piece of land. We need recreational grounds for sizable places of place. So it can only be possible when you avoid piecemeal planning and hang up real plans. Then also let us go back to the real practice, the practice that used to be when the town and country planning board did exist. The requirement was when such plans are up, they are hanged up and the public appreciates them. The public buys in. The public gets to know this is a planned recreation ground, gets to know this is a planned school, gets to know what has been planned for them. They participate because they hang them up and let them know there is a plan which is going to affect them, that they have to buy in. When the public buys in such plans, it will be very hard for another developer to come and change some of them, because the entire village participated in accepting this plan. They got to know what is where and why, because they asked their questions. They got to know why each of these elements are involved in this detailed plan. Now, lack of that kind of practice and going on with what is going on, which I'm calling piecemeal planning, you cannot avoid what is happening.
Yes.
So I think wherever the town and country planning was taken, maybe in the authority, some of those practices which were supposed to be functions of it should be continued with. The public needs to know what are these plans, what is where. The public needs to critique these plans and then when they buy in, it will be very hard to change some of these because it becomes now a public thing. It's not a private thing, it's not somebody's thing. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Wabasa. And Michael, to you, the last 2 minutes as a financier in this space. What are the top 3 things you would like us to hear as we wrap up this discussion today? Mr. Mugabe, did you hear the question?
Yeah. Thank you very much, Michael. My namesake Paul Michael of Kenya. Thank you very much for this very good question. Number 1 is that we must address the question of affordable housing. And I think that will be done from supply side, removing the bottlenecks, the constraints that impact on the supply side. And I think we've touched on this throughout this webinar through technology, collaboration, research, engagement, awareness. Quite a lot has been, right from land acquisition through to the whole setup of house construction and the value chain, which I mentioned earlier, is quite a problem. So there are affordable housing. The second one is financing. We cannot, the two go in tandem. We cannot ignore the issue of funding. We must look to have access of long-term cheap sources of funds. Government must come in, engagement with the external funders is quite healthy and they're quite strong, especially if it's targeted towards the low-income segment. Happy to have my brief engagement with a few of them. They're quite happy to do that. That's very key. I think that's one area that we can raise our voice to. There's quite a lot that we can cover in that space, including managing costs and other aspects that feed into cost of funds and so the price of money that's finally ultimately impacts on demand. The other aspect is I think we must be able to look at collaboration and partnership. And I think it has come out clear. Look at the wealth of knowledge shared here in this webinar in terms of what can be done differently. There are various entities here represented here. The ministry, okay, fine, not here, but very been engaged. The think tanks, the innovators that you already took all in your question to me and other speakers that have panelists that have actually spoke to that. We cannot achieve traction unless we agree to, we talked about planning that to have collaboration with various entities, stakeholders that are involved in the value chain, because housing is a very key component. And if you're going to address housing in terms of it being an aspect, not just of the real economy, but something that's very close to us from just being basic to wealth creation, source of storing value, it's something we can do. I think collaboration becomes important. Partnership, strategic partnership become very key. And I think for me, it's one of the key things we should move out with. If we address price availability of affordable houses and we address funds, financing for these houses, we shall address the issue of demand and supply. And then we go through different aspects. When we do through partnership, we can address policy. We can address all these issues that components that have actually that feed into these two, demand and supply, and ultimately we shall be solving this deficit, which is a big issue for us as a country, and which is a big thing in terms of how it feeds into the economy and the GDP of our country. So thank you, Paul. For me, I think these three are very key. Strategic partnerships, looking to initiatives for affordable availability of affordable units, and number three is funding, financing for these units, so that we address demand, supply, and then address other aspects. I think through collaboration, government can actually be brought on board so that issues of waivers, incentives, support cannot be addressed. Thank you very much, Paul.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mugabe. And we have really drawn towards the end of this webinar. I'd like to recognize all our guests. Thank you for being with us. Mr. Patrick Rubongoya, the chief discussant, Architect Patricia Kayongo Rutiba, Dr. Charles Amoti Kojo, Mr. Samu Abasa, and Mr. Michael K. Mugabe. We do appreciate your time and contribution. We will be having the webinar. The next webinar is addressing fashion and clothing in Uganda. So it is something that we really need to speak to if you can read the weather and the climate around us today. But it's been my privilege to host this webinar today, and I would like to hand over to Dr. James Magara to give the closing remarks from CASO. Dr. Magara, over to you.
Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you very, very much, all our panelists, for taking the time to engage, accepting to be part of this discussion, and giving us your brains. We've picked your brains. There are reporters who have been picking up the ideas. I hope we can carry on the conversation outside this forum. I'd be very keen to know what happens between Dr. Kojo and Mr. Mugabe concerning the bamboo. And I do hope this has also been a time for us to create linkages. We have had the popular thing, government at Tuyambe. Unfortunately, government was not on this platform today. But this kind of engagements go a long way in actually helping the government, because the government can't do everything. But if we can keep engaging like this, we have a better chance to help the government make the right decisions. So thank you. Thank you very much also, participants. I've been seeing the participant list, and you've also stayed engaged, which means that you've been very interested in what's going on. And please we'll follow through. Our website will have the final draft. If you want to come back to it, please also note that Facebook, all these recordings are on Facebook. So if anyone missed and you'd like to refer them to the webinar, or you yourself would like to review certain parts of it, you can always go to Facebook, CASO Think Tank page. You'll see all the previous webinars, and you can also draw from that as well as a resource. As Paul has said, we will be in again next week. We are looking, there's still so much ground to cover. We're looking at the clothing, the whole area of apparels, clothing, fashion, and we'll be looking forward to having you join us and also inform others who may be interested in this particular sector. But do keep your eye on the emails and also on the flyers we send out so that you can join us for further conversations. So thank you once again, and wish you a very, very good weekend. Paul, am I closing or somebody else's?
Yes, you are, Dr. Magara. Go ahead and close.
All right, thank you. Let's just have a word of prayer as we close. Lord, we thank you for this time and for the very many ideas that have come out. We do recognize that we have a very serious challenge as a country. And we ask that the ideas that have been shared here will help us to get them to the desks of those who make decisions, and Lord, that they'll play a part in improving our environment, both in the area of the urban and rural areas, and also in the places where we live. We pray you bless the rest of our day. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, and bless you all.
Bye.